Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you to everybody who is here in attendance. I'll be focusing on the Inland Empire, and my talk is going to be divided into 6 primary parts. Very briefly, I'm going to provide an update on COVID-19 in the region, and overall the trends have been very encouraging. I'm going to then move in to dive down into the region's economy. I'm going to first be talking about the region's labour market. Over a long-term perspective, the region's economy has been a land of opportunity. It's absorbed a lot of workers and provided a lot of jobs for people in the region. Another feature of the region's labour market is its resiliency during the pandemic. It's performed much better than other parts of the state's economy. We're then going to talk about output and consumption in the region. And again, over an extended period of time, we see that the region has been a growth machine with GDP growth that has been unparalleled in the state. We're then going to move on to talking about real estate, both residential and commercial. When I was trying to come up with a phrase which could best summarize what's been happening in the residential real estate market, the best word that I could come up with was wow. It has been quite a breathless move in the local residential real estate market over the past 18 months or so. With respect to the commercial real estate market, things are a little bit trickier. There have been some definite headwinds in certain subsectors of commercial real estate. The big question is going to be the extent to which these headwinds represent a permanent shock or a minor bump in the road. I'm going to finally end the discussion with some very brief remarks about what the future might look like in the region. First, I'm going to provide brief update on the COVID-19 situation in the region, and overall the news is incredibly positive. While there was a spike in cases in the early summer, we didn't come close to approaching the mass number of cases that we saw at the beginning of the year, and a big reason for this is vaccination. Whether we look across the state, in Riverside County or San Bernardino County, we see now that the majority of people are vaccinated, and that is going to be one of our best weapons when it comes to controlling the spread of the virus in the future. With respect to labour markets, I'm going to first start talking about the big picture. If we look over the last sort of 10 or 15 years, we see that the region has seen extraordinary employment growth. So if you were to look at the chart on the right, you can see that 380,000 jobs were added to the regional economy over the last 10 years alone. To place that number in perspective, there's only 4 cities in the state of California that have more jobs than were added to the Inland Empire economy over the past 10 years. Now, if we look at where some of that growth is occurring, it's still extraordinary to me, the sheer growth of the logistics sector in the region over the past 10 years. 160,000 jobs were added in the Inland Empire in the logistics sector alone, which accounts for around about 42% of all jobs added to the region's economy. I always have to double take when I look at the statistic, but if you look at the contribution of logistics job to the region's economy, today they count for around about 28%, or basically 1 in every 4 jobs in the Inland Empire can be attributed directly to the logistics sector of the economy. But overall, what we see over the past 10 years is great employment growth. Not only have we seen great employment growth, but the region has also done a great job of absorbing workers. So if you look at the chart on the left, you can see that the labour force in the Inland Empire has far outgrown the labour force growth in California and many of the peers for the Inland Empire in Southern California. And again, the chart on the right is showing you that not only is the region absorbing labour, but it's providing jobs for labour as well. So not only do we see more workers moving to the region, but the job growth in the region has far exceeded the job growth that we see at both a statewide level and compared to some of the peers, Inland Empire's peers in Southern California. Against this backdrop of strong job growth, there's been a consistent narrative with respect to the Inland Empire, with respect to wages. And we have seen real wages in the region grow over the past 10 years, but the Inland Empire does still lag both the state and again, some of its peers in Southern California. And if we were to sort of dig a little bit deeper into why that is the case, why is it that the wages in Inland Empire are lagging other parts of the state, I think the chart on the right does a pretty good job of summarizing this. What the chart shows is that if we look at workers who hold less than a college degree, so people who either have high school diplomas, have less than high school education or some college, the wages of those workers in Inland Empire are comparable to the wages earned by equivalent workers in the rest of the state of California. The big difference we see is with respect to people who hold a college degree or a graduate or professional degree. Here we see that the wages paid in California are around about 20 to 23% higher than the wages which are paid to equivalent workers in the Inland Empire. I think this represents an opportunity for the region as we look out into the future, and I'll return to this point later. Now, if we were to look at the labour market over the last 18 months, one of the things to note is that heading into the pandemic, the Inland Empire was adding jobs at a far faster clip than many other parts of the state. So in that period from February 19 to February 2020, the Inland Empire added jobs at a rate of 4.1%, which was effectively more than double the number of jobs which were added in the state over that period. What we also see in the chart on the left is the recovery of the respective labour markets listed here since the pre-pandemic peak. So if we measure job growth from February 2020 to September 2021, the Inland Empire has weathered some of the storm clouds a lot better than other parts of the state. The chart on the right gives us a pretty good indication for why this is the case. If we were to look across all of the sectors in the region's economy, many of them still employ fewer people than was the case prior to the pandemic. But we've seen great growth in the logistics sector, where during this period over the last 18 months, 29,000 jobs have been added to the region's economy. In the logistics sector, a growth of 7%. And that sort of is one of the reasons for the region's respective resiliency. That, and of course, the region's economy doesn't rely to the same extent as some of the coastal regions on tourism in particular. There's a lot of talk about the unemployment rate, and thankfully we're heading and trending in the right direction. But what is mentioned much less frequently is what has been happening with wages over the past 18 months. And we see in the Inland Empire, wages have increased by 5%. So this is due to a number of the reasons that we mentioned earlier in the presentation. The labour shortage in the face of strong demand for job growth is placing upward pressure on wages. So one of the most positive aspects of the labour market over the past 18 months has been this increase in wages, which is really continuing a trend which began 4 or 5 years prior to the pandemic. With respect to GDP, the Inland Empire's GDP on a relative basis has far outgrown GDP in places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, even in the state of California. In fact, since the year 2000, GDP has increased by around about 1.5 times, which is extraordinary growth. On the right chart shows GDP per capita, which is where the region has fared slightly less well. And again, this comes back to the point that I was making earlier and the point that I'll come back to later in the presentation, which is that the jobs being created in the region aren't paying quite the wages that are being paid in other parts of the state. Despite some of the gloomy headlines at the outset of the pandemic with respect to the impact that the pandemic would have on the economy, we saw in 2020 that taxable sales in the Inland Empire was greater than in the year prior, in 2019. And to the sort of point that we made in the first part of the presentation, this speaks to the strength of the consumer over this period. That again, despite a lot of the headlines we were seeing, taxable sales within the region actually increased, and in 2021 is on pace to outperform 2020 with respect to taxable sales as well. And an interesting point which you can see in the chart on the right is that the Inland Empire's taxable sales far outgrew taxable sales in California over this period. Taxable sales actually grew at a rate which is around about 50% quicker than in the rest of the state of California. Okay, residential real estate has been on fire over the past 18 months, and there's a couple of ways to dissect this. The first is with respect to home sales growth. While we saw home sales drop in the first part of 2020, the sales growth which has occurred since this time has more than offset the lost sales that would have occurred at the beginning of 2020. And in fact, we've now exceeded the pre-pandemic trend with respect to home sales. Home prices have been on an extraordinary tear over the past 18 months for some of the reasons that were mentioned by Chris at the beginning. We've seen healthy consumers by and large, low interest rates and relatively low inventories, and all this has created a cocktail in which home prices have jumped greatly over the past 18 months. In San Bernardino County, home prices have increased by around 27%. In Riverside County, the number is a little bit closer to 25%. I would just say, though, that home prices in the region are starting to become quite expensive relative to the rest of the nation. So when we compare the Inland Empire's house prices to some of the coastal communities in the region, they look cheap. But when we look at home prices in the Inland Empire with respect to the national economy, home prices are around about 50% higher than are found in the rest of the nation. And as I mentioned, a big part of the push in home prices has been the lack of supply. So if we were to look at housing inventory, the monthly supply of housing in the region is down at historic lows. Typically, we would think of a healthy housing market as one in which there's 6 months of supply. And although we've seen a slight increase off of the lows, there's still around about 2.5 months of supply in the region. And the time that a home is spending on the market, again, is at historical lows. These properties are being sold as quickly as they are hitting the market. One interesting feature of the residential real estate market in the region concerns permits. I showed you some slides at the beginning of the presentation which showed the increase in the labour force over the past 20 years and the extent to which the labour force in the region was really outgrowing labour force rates in the rest of the state and in other parts of the coastal communities of Southern California. But what we have seen over the last 4 or 5 years is residential permits in the Inland Empire start to level off quite a bit. And so what we would want to see in the future, if the Inland Empire is going to continue its role as this opportunity machine, which is able to absorb workers, we would like to see residential permits pick up a little bit more than they have been over the past few years. And I think the big area in which the Inland Empire has been lagging some of the communities in the rest of the Southern California is with respect to multifamily permits. Here we see places like San Diego and LA counties producing way more multifamily permits than is the case in the Inland Empire. And to put this figure in context, the chart on the left shows you single family permitting in the Inland Empire compared to California over the past 10 years. We're forever hearing about the supply problems at the statewide level, and the solution to this problem is for us to build more housing. But it's interesting to note that over the past 10 years, a number of single-family permits issued both in California and in the Inland Empire have been somewhat constant. And the same is true for multifamily permits. We see that the Inland Empire has been somewhat on track with what has been happening with California over the past 10 years. And again, to reiterate, if the Inland Empire is going to continue absorbing new residents, we really need to see a pickup in permits as we head out over the next 5 or 10 years. Commercial real estate is a little bit trickier to dissect than the residential real estate market. One of the interesting questions as we look out over the next few years is going to be what is going to happen to demand for office space. There's been a lot of talk in the media about the virtual office and how this could transform cities and where workers live throughout the country. There's a couple of things to note here. First, With respect to the office market, we have seen some headwinds over the past 18 months. We have seen vacancy rates start to tick up, not just here in California and the Inland Empire, but also across the United States. And one of the interesting questions surrounding the demand for office space centers around work from home trends. So in this chart on the left here, the Census Bureau has tracked the share of people working from home by different occupations in the US economy. And one thing to note is that since the beginning of the pandemic, the number of people who report working from home has actually been steadily declining. But what we have seen is that those occupations which are most likely to be working in offices, that's the management, business, financial operations and professional services, we still see a relatively high share of the people working in these occupations, around about 25%, who report working from home. So what does that mean for the demand for office as we look out over the next couple of years or beyond? This chart on the right is survey data which is produced by economists at Stanford University. And in this survey, they asked both workers and employees what is their preference with respect to work from home arrangements. So they asked workers, ideally, how many days of the week would you like to work from home? And workers report that they would, on average, like to work from home 2.5 days a week. Employers see things slightly differently. Employers report that they would, in an ideal scenario, see their employees working from home just 1 day a week. So whether we look at this from the employers or the employees' perspective, there seems to be an expectation that people will be returning to the office in some capacity over the coming months. So stories of the virtual office or the death of the office do seem to be overshot presently, but what it might mean is that as we look out into the future, how we use office space might begin to change. With respect to retail, there's not a great change in the data over the past 18 months with respect to longer term trends. The cost of rents in retail spaces have been somewhat constant, and we've seen a very minor uptick in vacancy rates. And all of this, there are two things to note here. I think one, the secular long-term trends are still in place. We're still moving to a world in which more online consumption is going to occur, and this is going to create a headwind for the retail for retail space. Another feature is, or one of the reasons for the resiliency of retail over the last 18 months is the fact, it goes back to the taxable sales slide. Consumers have had a lot more money in their pocket and they haven't been spending all that money online. So demand for sort of in-person retail has been pretty robust given the sort of relative affluence of consumers over the past 18 months. But I don't think any of this is going to change the long-term trend, which is one in which we will see a greater transition to online consumption. With respect to warehouse and distribution, we see an entirely different picture over the past 18 months. In the Inland Empire and across the US, we've seen rents increasing. We've also seen vacancies dropping in a pronounced way over the past 18 months. And of course, this has to do with a lot of the sort of pandemic trends. A lot more online consumption, or the increase in online consumption has meant a greater demand for warehouse and distribution facilities, which has really put upward pressure on rents and pushed vacancies lower. And we expect that this trend will continue again as we look out into the future. The secular trends are real, and the demand for warehouse and distribution facilities is not going away anytime soon. I'm going to turn now to some of the opportunities and challenges with which the Inland Empire is going to be faced over the next 10 years. And I think there's two ways that we can dissect economic growth. One of the aspects of growth is a quantitative dimension, and another dimension is a more qualitative perspective. If we look at the chart on the left, the Inland Empire has been great quantitatively over the last 20 years. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, it has both absorbed a lot of people and created a lot of jobs. So from a quantitative standpoint, the region has done great. The next step in the region's evolution is going to be more of a sort of a qualitative shift. And if we look at the chart on the right, we look at the share of college degree holders in the Inland Empire compared to the state of California. And this is an area where the Inland Empire still lags. And what is the reason for this difference in the number of college degree holders in the Inland Empire compared to California? Well, one of the reasons for this is that, to go back to a chart that I used earlier on, there are not a lot of high-paying jobs in the Inland Empire for college degree holders with respect to how these college degree holders are paid in the rest of the state. The chart on the right shows the workers in the Inland Empire that commute to other regions. So the chart on the right tracks people who commute out of the Inland Empire for work. And there's a perception that the Inland Empire was a bedroom community, that people who had jobs in LA and Orange counties and San Diego counties who had low-paying jobs, couldn't afford to live in these coastal communities, so moved to the Inland Empire where housing was cheaper. But if you actually look at the data, what we see is that the largest share of workers commuting out of the region for work were actually people who hold bachelor's degrees and grad degrees. Around about 25% of bachelor and graduate degree holders in the Inland Empire commute out of the region for work. And what is the reason for that? The reason for this is that within the Inland Empire, there's not enough jobs to satisfy, a better term would be, there's not enough supply of jobs for college degree holders in the region. And as we look out to the next 10 years, we would like to start to see a shift whereby the Inland Empire is creating better paying jobs so that there's less need for people with college degrees, with graduate degrees to leave the region to commute to the coastal communities. Okay, I'm going to finish my presentation by talking about the short-term outlook as well as the big picture. So with respect to the jobs recovery, we'd expect the region's economy to replace all of the jobs that were lost during the pandemic in 2020. There's sort of deficit of around about 50,000 jobs. And like I said, in 2020, we would expect the region to be out of that jobs deficit that was created. We'll also expect unemployment levels to near their pre-recession levels as well. In the short term, I think we can expect to see upward pressure on wages. Again, this comes back to the conversation about labour supply and the fact that there are more jobs than there are people to fill these jobs at the present time. Consumers are as healthy as they've ever been and will continue spending in the region over the short term as well. We would expect house prices to soften. I think that it's unrealistic to think that house prices will continue to grow at 25% a year as we start to see mortgage rates tick up a little. That is going to lead to a softening in house price growth. That doesn't mean that house prices are going to shrink. That doesn't mean that house prices are going to collapse. The fundamentals remain strong. We were just on a unsustainable trajectory with respect to house price growth. And if we go back to one of the slides we looked at the beginning of the presentation, 28% of the jobs in the Inland Empire are found in the logistics sector of the economy. The secular trends in place means that this, or at least the number of people employed in the logistics sector, is only going to increase as we look out into the future, and this is going to maintain a strong demand for warehousing in the region. With respect to the big picture, the Inland Empire for 20 years now has been a growth machine, it's been an opportunity machine. This has absorbed a lot of people and it's grown a lot of jobs. And the region is a veritable economic development success story. But as with every economic development story, there are going to be different phases to development. And some of the advantages that the Inland Empire has held over the past 20 years will start to diminish slightly as we look out into the future. So if we were to think about price, or the region's price advantage, for example, when I showed you those house prices in Riverside County and San Bernardino County, they look cheap relative to the rest of California. But relative to the rest of the nation, the region is starting to become somewhat expensive. These price increases are also going to translate into the commercial real estate market as well. And ultimately, as we look out into the future over the next sort of 10, 20 years, the economy will have to transition to one which is providing higher paying jobs. The true key to sustainable economic growth is going to be the ability for the region's economy to move beyond one which has been a quantitative success to one which is able to focus on more qualitative aspects of economic growth as well. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.